Bills, third reading, projet de loi, troisième lecture. Number 1, Bill C-20.
Senator Omidvar.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable Senators, I move that this bill be read a third time.
L'honorable sénatrice Omidvar.
Honourable Senator Omidvar, seconded by Honourable Senator Clement, moves that the bill be read a third time. On debate, Senator Omidvar.
Colleagues, I rise today to speak at third reading to Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments. This bill is the last government bill I sponsor, as I retire from the Senate. But like the other two previously, it reflects the aspirations of so many stakeholders, and it aligns very closely with my values. This bill is about trust, about building trust and restoring trust. Trust for those who encounter Canada's law enforcement agencies and come away from this experience feeling that their rights were disrespected or abused. Trust through access to an avenue for their complaints to be heard by an institution that is independent from the law enforcement agencies, the CBSA and the RCMP. The bill also comes to us, colleagues, with a certain amount of urgency. It may represent a last opportunity for us to build this bridge to trust, a bridge between our promise to all our citizens for law, order and good governance on the one hand, and its experience by vulnerable communities on the other. The Senate Standing Committee on National Security, Defence and Veterans Affairs heard from witnesses representing these communities who too often experience negative interactions with law enforcement. I wish to thank Senator Dean, Chair of SecD, and the members of the committee for their thoughtful and fulsome study of C-20. The committee heard about the vulnerabilities of individuals, racialized minorities, Indigenous peoples, people who may not speak either English or French, asylum seekers who are particularly vulnerable to law enforcement because of their context, as well as those detained by the CBSA or in a CBSA-run immigration holding center. These testimonies reminded us to take notice of institutional discrimination, systemic racism, and the realities that many racialized, Indigenous, and other vulnerable populations face when interacting with law enforcement. At committee, witnesses spoke to the need for increased accountability and transparency in Canadian law enforcement, especially as it relates to the CBSA, as this continues to be the only federal law enforcement agency without any civilian review. And while they shared that C-20 could be doing more, could be improved, could be changed, most agreed that the bill needs to come into law as is. Amnesty International, the Canadian Council of Refugees, the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, the Canadian Muslim Lawyers Association, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, others all agreed that this bill is too important to fail being so close to the finish line. This sentiment was summarized by the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and I quote, "Given a potentially shortened timeline in the other place, before this bill could potentially vanish from the order papers, this bill should pass before the end of the session." I want to be clear, they had compelling testimony and raised important issues. So whilst they urged us to pass this bill as is, they also urged the government to listen to their issues in the regulation-making process. I believe this is a message that the government must hear. So I strongly urge the government to consult, not just by checking off a box, but to vigorously consult with these groups when creating regulations, because their concerns are real. Colleagues, concerns around accountability and systemic racism in law enforcement, which many of these groups spoke about, will not be solved with any single measure, even if it is a new bill. But this is an opportunity we must seize, perhaps a first opportunity, but an imperative one. C-20 is part of broader efforts to ensure law enforcement interactions remain respectful, professional, and exempt from discrimination. It is worth perhaps examining the urgency of this bill against the cascade of events that preceded it. Let me take you back to September 11th, 2001, a horrific day in all our histories. As a result, the Government of Canada passed a number of laws, including the anti-terrorism law, but it also called in December 2003 the CBSA into being without an independent review body. In 2002, Meher Arar, a Canadian Syrian citizen, was wrongfully detained during a layover in the United States and deported to Syria, Russia on my mind, where he was subjected to severe torture and inhumane treatment. This happened because the RCMP provided U.S. authorities with erroneous information, falsely implicating Mr. Arar in terrorist activities. The public outcry over this ordeal prompted the government to launch a thorough inquiry led by Justice Dennis O'Connor. In 2006, the inquiry's findings fully exonerated Mr. Arar, revealing serious misconduct and flaws in the actions of both the RCMP and border officials. As I noted in my second reading speech, one of the most crucial outcomes of that inquiry was recommendations at preventing such miscarriages of justice in the future. Foremost among those was the creation of a robust, independent mechanism for both agencies, the RCMP and the CBSA, to enhance accountability, ensure strict adherence to legal standards, and protect the rights of individuals from being violated. That was in 2006. Years later, the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security recommended that the government establish an independent civilian review mechanism and complaints body for all CBSA activities. In 2014 and 2015, Senator Wilfred Moore introduced legislation, S-222 and S-205, to provide for the appointment of an Inspector General of the CBSA. Both bills died on the order paper. But the government did agree with the intent of the bill, whilst not the mechanism, and mandated former Privy Council Clerk Mel Kapp to review and recommend further action. His report recommended the basic structure that C-20 outlines. Following that, in 2017 and in 2019, Parliament created mechanisms in the national security sphere. They created NCIRA and NCCOP. But government bills to create an independent civilian complaints review commission, as recommended by Justice O'Connor, as recommended by Mel Kapp, died on the order paper. Although not successful, they demonstrate a persistent need and political will to create such a mechanism. Today, 18 years later, from when Justice O'Connor tabled his recommendations, we are, I believe, I hope, I sincerely hope, almost at the finish line. We know that the CBSA today is different from what it was in 2003, in 2006, and in 2014, when the first bill for an independent review was tabled. Current national and international environments make the need for an independent review even more pressing. During SECTI discussions on C-20, we had the opportunity to hear from Public Safety Minister, the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc. I asked him what was at stake here as we contemplate the last stage of Bill C-20's adoption. His response, and I quote, was that we are facing a potentially short runway with a unique opportunity to make a very significant improvement in this area. To make perfection the enemy of the possible at this particular moment would be unfortunate. So is Bill C-20 perfect? Not at all. I don't believe any bill is ever perfect. But considering the long cascade of events that I've described to you, and considering the real benefit to Canadians, I hope that we will agree not to let this opportunity vanish. It improves on previous iterations of this recommendation. First, Senator Moore's bill, S-222, but also two more recent government bills in the other House, which both died on the order paper. Each iteration has evolved, has changed, has improved to reflect stakeholder views and expert advice around law enforcement. Bill C-20 will not only create a stronger review body, but it will also contribute to our nation's efforts to pursue reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and racialized minorities and respond to concerns around systemic racism within law enforcement. It will also respond to various expert and stakeholder recommendations, including those of the Mass Casualty Commission and House Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security report on systemic racism in policing in Canada. Let me briefly remind you how C-20 will lead to the desired outcomes of better reporting and overall accountability. It's an efficient model that aims to strengthen, not erode, existing accountability frameworks. The deputy heads of the two agencies, the RCMP and the CBSA, will remain accountable to the Minister of Public Safety, and the Minister will remain accountable to Parliament for actions taken or not taken by the RCMP and the CBSA. The bill will require richer, deeper, and more detailed reporting to Parliament, and there are timelines in the legislation to ensure appropriate responses. The RCMP and the CBSA will be required to annually report on what they have done in response to the PCRC recommendations. The PCRC will itself file an annual report. And further, as part of the annual reporting to Parliament, a new requirement will require the PCRC to collect, for the first time, race disaggregated and demographic disaggregated data about complainants. This will contribute to identifying intersectional systemic issues in law enforcement and develop responses. These components of the bill are the part of why it is so urgently needed. I know some of you had questions around the bill's absence of a statutory review period. Please note that we as senators would have the ability to review the PCRC Act at any time, and particularly after enough time elapses to assess its effectiveness and the way it is implemented. We will have access to the annual reports filed by the CBSA, by the RCMP, and by the Minister himself. To paraphrase Mel Capp, former clerk of the Privy Council, who we heard from just a few days ago, improved reporting under Bill C-20 is what would allow us as parliamentarians to identify if this bill is being carried out appropriately. Honourable Senators, C-20 is much more than just about reviewing the actions of the RCMP and the CBSA. It is about justice, reform, fairness, transparency, accountability. We depend on these agencies to maintain the rule of law in this country. The officers are entrusted with wide-ranging powers. Canadians expect and deserve assurances that these powers are not abused or misused. In short, we expect and deserve consistent, fair, and equal treatment and an effective accountability mechanism when this treatment is not forthcoming. Before I conclude my remarks today, I would like to thank those many who have taken time to share with us their experience and expertise and make key recommendations that help build this robust proposed legislation. Let's get this important work done now and turn our attention to an orderly and efficient implementation of this bill. I hope that my colleagues will help ensure the passage of a bill that has been unanimously supported in the other place, a rare feat and one that speaks volumes about the robustness of the bill. Let us show Canadians that we too, in this place, can reach such a consensus for a bill that stands to make a powerful improvement to law enforcement's accountability to Canadians. Thank you, colleagues.